A chilling introduction. The case that rocked America, April 1st, 2012 wasn't supposed to be anything special in the small, somewhat sleepy American city of Madfield, Illinois. It was a quiet Sunday evening, the kind where families gathered together for dinner and teenagers hung out in the corner booths of local diners talking about Little League victories and school gossip. Yet unnoticed by most, a fuse was waiting to be lit. A sequence of events that would not only devastate a family and shake up an entire immigrant community, but also expose horrifying gaps in America's emergency response system. Across the United States, immigrant communities often wrestle with a paradoxical sense of belonging. In Madfield, the sizable Mexican-American community had for decades built lives that were both distinctly American and deeply rooted in their own traditions. They cooked traditional dishes on holidays, gathered for church socials, and sent their children off to local schools wearing the team colors of the Madfield Lions. But beneath the vibrant surface, many continued to face subtle, persistent forms of exclusion. From lack of access to resources to not-so-veiled racist comments at the grocery store, to an ever-present sense that to some neighbors, they'd always be outsiders. It was against this backdrop that a nightmarish crime unfolded. That Sunday night, as the city's streetlights flickered to life, a frantic 911 call shattered the silence at the city's emergency dispatch center. On the other end was a panicked female voice, Maria Gutierrez, a young Mexican-American woman, her words trembling as she tried to describe an assault and plead for help. Her voice carried all the fear, pain, and confusion one could imagine in their worst nightmares. "Please, I don't know exactly where I am. I was just walking from the elementary school toward Franklin Park. Please, someone's after me." But technology, crucial as it is to modern policing, would prove alarmingly ineffective that night. In 2012, cell phone triangulation was imprecise at best, especially in small towns with outdated infrastructure. Dispatchers couldn't immediately pinpoint Maria's exact location. The only clues: she was somewhere between a local elementary school and a public park, a vague stretch in a town filled with similar-looking houses and shadowy sidewalks. Moments later, terror exploded through the phone line. On the 911 recording, the chilling sound of a door splintering, the heart-wrenching cries of a woman in mortal danger, and then, a horrific silence as the call was drowned in chaos. The dispatcher's desperate attempts to reconnect went unanswered. By the time local authorities pieced together who Maria was and began mobilizing a response, precious time had already slipped away. The tragic series of missteps that unfolded over the next 12 hours would grip not only Madfield but the entire country. Media outlets, drawn by the mystery and the community's pain, arrived in droves. Talk radio, online forums and cable news debated endlessly. Did systemic prejudice play a role in the slow police response? Was it outdated technology, linguistic barriers, or a lack of urgency at play? As the investigation wore on, every hour without answers only heightened the anxiety and outrage among Maria's loved ones and the broader Mexican-American population, who saw themselves reflected in her struggle and suffering. What followed was a public reckoning, not just for the city's law enforcement but for every institution responsible for keeping people safe. In courtrooms and community meetings, on the front lawns of Madfield and across social media, Americans began asking uncomfortable questions. If something like this could happen in their town, who exactly is safe? And what could be done so that no family would ever have to wait again while a loved one's desperate call for help went unanswered? Thus began the case that would force not just a town, but an entire nation to confront what happens when fear, prejudice, and bureaucratic inertia conspire to leave a citizen unheard in their moment of greatest need. Life-and-death moments and police delays, M thought Maria lived and where she actually was, triggered a delay that, in hindsight, proved catastrophic. For nearly 2 hours after the initial call, emergency teams scrambled to triangulate Maria's possible location. Without GPS pings or precise cell tower triangulation, their search zone was frustratingly vague, just a stretch of blocks between the school and Franklin Park, a neighborhood typical of small-town America, filled with identical rows of brick-fronted homes and overgrown lawns. The officers canvassed the area with an unsettling sense of helplessness, methodically combing through alleyways and city parks, pressing their ears against apartment doors, and peering through shadowed windows, hoping for any sign of movement or distress. The officers themselves felt the mounting pressure. It was late at night, the streets mostly deserted save for the occasional dog barking at the commotion or a porch light flickering on. Wanting to avoid undue alarm or accusations of profiling, local police tried to keep their search as unobtrusive as possible. leading them to pass by many houses in silence, knocking only on those where they thought they heard something unusual. They didn't want to be seen as harassing the predominantly Mexican-American residents, knowing all too well the fraught history between law enforcement and minority communities in the area. Meanwhile, Maria's family was caught in their own agony of waiting, desperate for updates and racked by guilt at not knowing the right information to offer authorities. The tension was palpable. Neighbors peered from behind curtains, gossip spread through late-night phone calls, and the word missing was already being whispered on group texts and community forums. All the while, the precious window for saving Maria, if such hope had ever existed, narrowed with every tick of the clock. Adding to the confusion was the lack of direct communication between different precincts. Initial communication about Maria's disappearance, and her last known whereabouts, was slow to travel between city agencies. Only after prolonged back and forth did the Central Dispatch send out special teams to the area Maria had described in her call. But by then, the sense of urgency had begun to wane. The concrete steps that might have saved her life were shadowed by bureaucratic red tape and a chilling uncertainty about where to begin. The endless search in the night. As the clock ticked relentlessly past midnight, the tiny city of Madfield was awash in an uneasy silence. It was the kind of silence that felt heavy, almost suffocating in the wake of Maria Gutierrez's chilling 911 call. The search for her had become an urgent rescue operation, yet the reality on the ground was unnervingly bleak. Dozens of local officers, hastily assembled and still shaking off the fatigue of a long Sunday evening, spread out through a maze of dimly lit streets, alleyways tangled with overgrown hedges, and playgrounds lying empty under the pale glow of streetlights. The neighborhood between the elementary school and Franklin Park was typically friendly by day, but at this hour, its familiarity gave way to suspicion. Every shadow could have hidden the worst. Because Madfield's Mexican-American community was both close-knit and wary of law enforcement, the police were walking a delicate line. They wanted to move fast, every second counted, but also had to avoid stirring panic, waking sleeping children, or, worst of all, being accused of harassing residents. That meant officers were often moving quietly, sometimes pausing outside doors to listen for muffled sounds, sometimes shining flashlights through the cracks of drawn curtains, and always trying to balance urgency with a visible respect for privacy. But the search area was frustratingly undefined, and in a town with rows and rows of near-identical brick houses, every clue felt as if it might simply vanish into the night. Patrol cars performed slow loops along the perimeter, headlights cutting through fog as officers leaned out with flashlights, scanning every mailbox and patch of overgrown grass for some sign of disruption. Some officers paced the length of basketball courts, pressing their hands against cold chain-link fences, aching for anything, a cry, the shuffle of footsteps, a dropped item that might point them toward Maria. Inside the houses, residents whispered anxiously, watching the blue and red flashes reflect off their living room walls. Word had already spread on community group chats, someone was missing, and fear was creeping beneath the skin of everyone in the neighborhood. A few brave neighbors peered out from behind curtains while others texted loved ones, urging them to lock doors and keep a watchful eye in case the worst lurked just outside. As hours dragged on and hope frayed, the search became frantic. Reinforcements arrived, first a pair of detectives from the neighboring county, then an additional patrol unit. The command post swelled with officers huddled over hand-drawn maps, circling possible routes Maria could have taken. Walkie-talkies crackled with frustrated voices. "Nothing on Maple! Check over on Parkside! I need backup at the playground! Did you see that movement near the dumpster?" But each dead end bred only more worry and self-doubt among the searchers. They wondered if they'd passed by Maria's desperate hiding place, if a cry for help had gone unheard above barking dogs or the distant rumble of freight trains. The longer the night stretched, the more the adrenaline waned, replaced by a colder, gnawing sense that time was running out for Maria, and that Madfield, for all its apparent tranquility, might never feel safe again. Sinister clues revealed, and horrifying discovery. By the time the sun began to rise over Madfield, fatigue and anxiety had settled heavily on the officers and the community alike. The neighborhood had been combed for hours, warnings sent through group chats, and hope was dwindling. Then, at around 9 a.m., a glimmer of a lead surfaced. A local resident, bleary-eyed from a restless night, approached an officer stationed at the corner of Maple Street. The man hesitated, then confessed he had been kept awake most of the night. He'd heard chilling, persistent cries just past midnight that seemed to be coming from the ground-level apartment near his store, next to a well-known paint shop. At the time, he tried to brush it off as a domestic squabble, but the sounds, a mix of crying and what could have been pleading, refused to leave his mind. He added to the officer's anxiety by swearing he'd seen no one come or go from that unit since dawn, and, pacing nervously, gestured toward the side alley flanked by overgrown hedges leading to the apartment's battered steel door. The paint shop's owner, who'd spent the night working a late shift, quickly corroborated his story. "It was right in that unit, a woman screaming and apologizing. 'I'm sorry, I'm sorry!' That's what I heard," he told them, anxious and insistent. The urgency in his voice compelled the officers to act, and after repeated attempts to get an answer at the door, their patience wore thin. The situation felt eerily connected to the previous night's frantic 911 call. When they announced their intent to break down the door, a heavy silence hung in the air as the Ram collided with the weather-beaten entrance. The door finally yielded, and officers entered a scene that would burn itself into their memories forever. The apartment was unusually small, with a cramped kitchen flowing straight into a makeshift living space, and the sour, rust-tinged stench of blood saturated the humid morning air. The moment their flashlights swept across the bedroom, a collective dread engulfed the room. Draped carelessly over what appeared to be an oddly shaped pile was a soiled off-white bedsheet. As they drew closer, the unmistakable metallic scent grew almost oppressive. With trembling hands, one officer gingerly pulled back the sheet. What lay beneath defied the bounds of their training, the lifeless body of a woman, nearly unrecognizable save for her face, surrounded by blood-soaked rags and, horror upon horror, several large black trash bags haphazardly stuffed full. The grim reality quickly became clear. The contents of those bags were not garbage but gruesome remains, body parts cut meticulously, the work of a disturbed and methodical mind. There was no doubt this was Maria Gutierrez, the young woman whose harrowing cry for help had echoed on the other end of that 911 call barely 10 hours before. Shocked into near disbelief, the officers were silent. Even the most seasoned detectives felt the urge to step back, the ordeal too overwhelming, the proximity to senseless violence almost suffocating. Word spread rapidly. A homicide of gruesome proportions had shattered the sleepy calm of Madfield, and with it, unleashed a tidal wave of anger, fear, and soul-searching throughout both the local immigrant community and the wider American public. Suspect profile and contradictory testimony. Juan Morales' name had never caused much of a stir in Madfield before that Monday morning. To most, he was invisible. A soft-spoken 42-year-old immigrant from Mexico who paid his rent on time, picked up shifts at a local auto parts warehouse, and exchanged polite nods with neighbors, but rarely spoke more than a handful of words. Morales' apartment, nestled beside the paint store on Maple Street, appeared as nondescript as the man himself. A cluttered two-room space, blinds always drawn, the faint smell of fried onions and lemon cleaner often wafting from beneath the door. When officers handcuffed him outside that morning, neighbors watched with a mix of confusion and disbelief. For years Morales had gone about his life largely undisturbed, his small stature and reserved demeanor seemingly at odds with the violence now whispered about on every block. Some recalled brief, awkward interactions. He'd apologize repeatedly if his groceries blocked the sidewalk, or quietly help someone carry a heavy load. Few believed such a man could be involved in a crime of any gravity, let alone something that would send ripples across the nation. Inside the station, Morales folded in on himself under the harsh fluorescent lights. He spoke in a halting, almost mechanical English, eyes flickering to the window, the table, anywhere but the detectives. Initially, his statement was simple. Yes, he had seen Maria Gutierrez that night. A chance encounter on the sidewalk led to an argument, which escalated in the privacy of his apartment. He claimed a moment of rage and confusion, nothing premeditated, nothing planned. "It just happened," he told them. "We fought, and I lost control." But the police found holes in this story immediately. Security footage obtained at Maria's family's urging showed Morales trailing the young woman in the wan pools of light cast by street lamps, keeping a calculated distance, pausing behind the bushes once she crossed into the alley. He wore a dark windbreaker, hood up, his gait shockingly unhurried. Not once did he call out to Maria. Instead, he watched, waiting. Forensic analysts, scrutinizing timestamps, pieced together a meticulous timeline that disputed Morales' tale of coincidence and sudden violence. The distance he covered, the route he took, none matched his initial description. Interrogators pushed harder. When confronted with footage from outside the paint store, Morales stammered and shifted in his seat, then quietly admitted to following Maria longer than he had said. Still, he insisted he never intended to hurt anyone. "I wanted to talk, I just wanted to talk," he repeated, low and almost pleading. For law enforcement, these contradictions were infuriating. Detectives speculated about motive. Was Morales fixated on Maria? Did a prior disagreement boil over? Was it a crime rooted in resentment, or something more sinister, a man burdened by his isolation lashing out at someone who represented everything he thought he'd never have? As his confession wore on, it became clear that Morales could not, or would not, offer a simple, consistent account of what fueled his actions that night. Each interview revealed new inconsistencies, changes in the order of events, confusion over time, deliberate omissions. Meanwhile, word of his arrest and shaky confession spread quickly. The Mexican-American community in Madfield, already rattled by the violence and scrutiny, now braced for a new wave of suspicion. For them, Morales's public unmasking was agonizing, not only for what he had admitted but for how easily his guilt would be projected onto thousands who shared only his accent and skin. For the rest of the region, the details of Morales's arrest, his contradictory answers, the evidence pieced together from hours of security footage, the quietly chilling glare in his mugshot, became a macabre parlor game, fueling harsh headlines and speculative shoutfests across every media outlet for days to come. The victim's family and distorted truth. Maria Gutierrez's family, a close-knit, determined group defined by resilience, tradition, and fierce loyalty, was devastated in ways that no public display of sympathy or justice system acknowledgement could remedy. From the moment the police notified them of Maria's death, their grief was intertwined with disbelief and an urgent, gnawing suspicion that pieces of the story didn't fit. Even in the most private moments of mourning, questions haunted them. Why did the authorities arrive so late? Why did early news reports focus on Maria's supposed temper, when they, more than anyone, knew she was gentle, quick to pacify conflict, and rarely raised her voice? Their anguish quickly turned outward, fueling a campaign, not just for justice, but for the whole truth. At first, the family's demands seemed straightforward. They pressed local authorities for a full accounting of their daughter's final hours and insisted on independent review of the case files. But every answer from police and city officials seemed curated, bureaucratic, another layer of abstraction over the human cost of Maria's loss. When media began to descend on their neighborhood, the family was struck by how their pleas were misrepresented or tidied up for consumption. Maria's parents cringed at headlines hinting at a lover's quarrel gone wrong or family disputes, neither of which had any root in Maria's real life or in the cold facts of her abduction. Maria's younger brother Luis became the family's accidental spokesperson. Fluent in English and Americanized in manner, Luis grew increasingly frustrated at press conferences, where sound bites were taken out of context and his calls for accountability reduced to a few vague clips about community frustration. His private resolve strengthened. He would not let Maria become just another sad statistic, or worse, a protagonist in a distorted public narrative that absolved the slow, inadequate police response. The Gutierrez family's skepticism sharpened over time. With support from neighbors and the local Mexican-American church, they pressured law enforcement to review all available surveillance footage. By now, the family was painfully aware that the first police search efforts had relied on outdated records and incomplete information. Mistakes that the public, if told plainly, might interpret as evidence of indifference or incompetence. Their efforts culminated in uncovering a crucial video feed from the elementary school, which, contrary to what police initially believed, showed Maria walking alone that night, visibly anxious and looking over her shoulder. Moments later, a shadow, later confirmed to be Juan Morales, appeared, trailing her at a distance. When the contents of this surveillance video were made public, the family's suspicions were confirmed. Not only had Maria not been involved in any heated argument the night of her disappearance, but the timeline meticulously built by police in their initial report was misleading. The narrative that she had in some way contributed to her own fate was shattered. The city's attempts to paint a picture of tragic misunderstanding fell apart. In that moment, Maria Gutierrez was no longer just a headline. She was a victim who had done everything possible to save herself, and, by extension, a symbol for those who felt invisible within the American justice system. Yet this victory, which Luis described in a bitter press interview as a small fragment of the truth wrung out by necessity, brought with it new bitterness. Even sympathetic reporters had to admit that their coverage, however well-intentioned, contributed to community tensions and reinforced stereotypes that clung to the Gutierrezes and their neighbors. Many in Madfield's immigrant enclaves whispered among themselves, asking if things would have gone differently if Maria had been from a prominent or long-established local family. Adding to the family's heartbreak was the persistent shadow of ethnic bias. News outlets continued to occasionally frame the tragedy as symptomatic of issues in the immigrant community or as a consequence of cultural clashes, ignoring that Maria had spent her life bridging those very divides. The victim's relatives bristled every time a TV anchor speculated about why someone like Maria may have put herself in harm's way, as though she bore any responsibility at all. For Maria's mother, a gentle woman whose English was halting but whose grief was universal, it was like losing her daughter a second time, not just to death, but to a narrative that erased her dignity. In private, the Gutierrezes conducted a parallel investigation of sorts. They went door to door, asking neighbors about the night of Maria's disappearance, searching for anyone who might recall a stranger lurking, a suspicious car idling, or even a distant scream. Some nights, Luis would sit at the kitchen table past midnight, piecing together timelines from different eyewitness accounts, determined to patch over the holes left by authorities. He collected digital copies of everything: voicemails, texts from Maria, even partial police radio logs that had been quietly handed to him by an officer sympathetic to their plight. As weeks wore on, the family's grief mixed with a slow-burning anger. They felt forced into the role of armchair detectives and public advocates, their private loss constantly paraded in the public eye, and yet at the same time, edited until unrecognizable by the machinery of media and public relations. It was exhausting, isolating, and at times deeply humiliating, but Maria's mother would not let her daughter's memory dissolve into a cautionary tale or an anonymous entry in a crime database. One of the Gutierrez's fiercest battles was with the police department itself. Despite mounting evidence that search protocols had broken down and communication between emergency responders and city agencies had been sluggish, officials remained slow to accept responsibility. The family filed official complaints, retaining a lawyer with experience in civil rights cases, and requested that the state attorney general review the Madfield police investigation for bias or negligence. They were careful, in every interview, to reiterate that their demand was not for retribution but for transparency, so that future victims would not face the same cascade of errors and indifference. The struggle took a toll on the entire family. Maria's siblings found themselves withdrawn at school, their friendships strained by awkward stares or ill-informed questions from classmates who'd watched unsettling news reports. Extended relatives debated whether to remain in Madfield or relocate to escape the stigma and the constant buzz of half-truths. Yet through all of it, the Gutierrezes maintained a united front. Maria belonged to them, not to the story spun by strangers or the narrative preferred by the authorities, and as much as their faith in public institutions faltered, their commitment to justice never wavered. What became clear to everyone who witnessed the family's ordeal was the enormous personal cost of chasing truth in a society where the voices of the vulnerable are too often subsumed beneath bureaucracy and the rush to maintain a veneer of order. Though the Gutierrezes never sought the spotlight, their struggle exposed the emotional, psychological, and moral toll inflicted when systems fail and the facts are bent to spare those in power embarrassment. Their fight for answers became as much about restoring Maria's dignity as ensuring that her final, desperate pleas for help would never again be ignored or twisted beyond recognition. System vulnerabilities and public outrage. The aftermath of Maria Gutierrez's tragic death sent shockwaves not only through Madfield but across the American public consciousness. As details began to emerge, fragmented timelines, delayed responses, and the gut-wrenching tapes of that 911 call, an unforgiving spotlight was cast on the flaws that lay hidden within the city's emergency response system. What began as a local crisis rapidly unraveled into a national reckoning over institutional accountability and the very concept of public safety. Within hours of the horrifying discovery, the first question started to swirl online. Why had it taken the police nearly half a day to locate Maria when the area in question wasn't even a full mile wide? How could officers on duty fail to prioritize an urgent 911 call, especially when a woman's voice, absolutely dripping with panic, was crying for her life? Social media became a crucible of anger. Hashtags denouncing police inaction and demanding transparency shot up the trending charts, live streams of community meetings and protests spread like wildfire beyond city limits. Local news cameras, hungry for answers, ambushed law enforcement outside the brick-faced Madfield Police Department building. Exhausted and visibly uncomfortable, the police chief and her top deputies stumbled through explanations leaning heavily on jargon, triangulation limitations, procedural uncertainty, resource constraints. But the more they tried to clarify, the deeper their credibility seemed to sink. To the Gutierrez family and their supporters, these words sounded dangerously close to excuses, and the wider public agreed. Footage of officers allegedly dozing during the search deep into the night, shared surreptitiously by frustrated volunteers, went viral and further fanned the flames. From the city council chambers to cable news panels, a blunt verdict echoed: the system, such as it was, failed catastrophically when it mattered most. But the criticism extended well beyond the frontline police. The cracks in the system ran deep. The city's 911 network, built on outdated infrastructure, couldn't provide GPS-level precision. Dispatchers struggled to obtain actionable information, leaving officers to work with vague, sometimes obsolete databases. Communications between precincts, supposed to be seamless in an emergency, in reality, bogged down in paperwork, bureaucratic silos, and a patchwork of radio frequencies, each with its own set of protocols. Volunteers and Maria's desperate family in their own grassroots search often outpaced official efforts simply by sharing real-time tips through group texts and social media. Their ad hoc coordination underscored a bitter irony. Ordinary people, untrained and unarmed, were picking up the slack left by the very organizations meant to protect them. Nowhere was the sense of betrayal sharper than among Madfield's immigrant and minority neighborhoods. For years, they'd quietly navigated the slow churn of the local bureaucracy, enduring reduced funding, cultural outsiderness, and routine microaggressions. When Maria's case exploded in the news, many felt not only the heartbreak of her loss, but the bitter validation of long-held suspicions that the system simply didn't value their safety on par with that of others. At community meetings, residents recounted with trembling voices stories of past emergencies where 911 calls were met with confusion, indifference, or outright skepticism. The Gutierrez tragedy pulled these private wounds into harsh daylight. In the days that followed, Madfield's small city hall was inundated with demands for answers. Civil rights groups, sensing a turning point, joined hands with grassroots organizations to organize vigils, rallies, and a petition campaign. Flyers in English and Spanish blanketed the town: "Never again forgotten, every call matters." The refrain at these gatherings was always the same: Maria's fate was not an unlucky fluke. It was the direct result of negligence, broken systems, and the failure to confront bias at every institutional level. Politicians, local and state, were forced into the fray. Some scrambled to reassure the public about coming reforms, while others, caught flat-footed, offered platitudes that rang hollow to grieving families. A few tried to deflect blame toward federal funding gaps or the complexities of integrating new technologies, but it was clear that nothing short of a sweeping overhaul would placate a public whose patience had snapped. The national media seized on the narrative, their coverage alternating between forensic dissections of Madfield's 911 response protocol and emotive profiles of Maria's family. Editorials lambasted not just a string of individual errors, but the systemic rot that enabled such errors to stack up until a young woman's life was forfeited to bureaucratic inertia. Inside police departments nationwide, uneasy watch commanders began quietly reviewing their own procedures for fear of becoming the next viral disaster. The Gutierrez case triggered a series of investigations, some public, some internal. The state attorney general announced an oversight review. The governor convened a task force to devise statewide minimum standards for emergency response times. At tense hearings, officials admitted, for the first time, that their systems lagged behind industry best practices. Notably, the inquiry revealed that some officers had skipped recommended crisis response academies, a decision justified by cost-cutting measures. Technological audits uncovered radios still running on analog frequencies, spots in the 911 grid with patchy coverage, and a digital backlog that slowed address updates for months. Amid this storm, the focus shifted to accountability. Every local talk show, neighborhood cookout, and city council meeting was ablaze with questions. Who would answer for these failures? Would individual officers face discipline, or would upper management take the fall? Was this a story of a few bad apples, or evidence that deeper rot lingered beneath the surface? In the absence of clear answers, anger metastasized into a sense of collective betrayal. Outrage was not confined to Madfield. Across the country, communities who'd long felt unprotected by law enforcement watched the story unfold with grim recognition. Maria's fate ignited broader debates about who in America could truly rely on the promise that help would arrive when they called. In city after city, grassroots groups cited the Gutierrez tragedy to push for new investments in multilingual dispatchers, culturally competent policing, and modern GPS-based emergency infrastructure. "Don't just mourn Maria," one activist wrote in an op-ed that quickly circulated online, "fix the world that let her down." As demands for reform reached a fever pitch, officials pledged new funding for technology upgrades and mandatory crisis training. Yet many observers, especially those in Madfield's most vulnerable communities, remained skeptical. Memories of past promises, made and then quietly abandoned, ran deep. Even as donations poured into the Gutierrez family's legal fund and politicians posed for somber photo ops with advocates, a quiet fear lingered. Would the momentum outlast the news cycle? The conversation also exposed how racial and socioeconomic biases shape policy outcomes. Multiple independent reviews revealed that neighborhoods with higher immigrant populations consistently reported slower response times and lower 911 resolution rates. For many, the lesson was clear. True justice for Maria Gutierrez would require not just punishing a few negligent individuals, but transforming an entire culture of public safety, replacing secrecy and inertia with openness, humility, and the constant drive to serve every member of the community as if their lives depended on it. Through it all, Maria's name became a rallying cry for change. The Gutierrez family, even in their grief, chose to channel public backlash into advocacy, demanding not just answers for their own loss, but safeguards for all who might one day walk in Maria's footsteps. Their tireless campaign inspired a surge of civic engagement, drawing new voices into the work of scrutinizing and rebuilding America's lifelines for the most vulnerable. As the months wore on and the media frenzy gradually subsided, the legacy of Maria's case endured. Lawmakers in Illinois introduced a Maria's Law, mandating annual reviews of emergency response failures and funding technical upgrades for small-town 911 centers. Civil rights organizations used the case to win court-ordered transparency measures, ensuring all emergency call records would be released to the public in cases of fatal outcomes. Police departments nationwide implemented new protocols, requiring officers to physically check every possible location described by a distressed caller, even if the information seemed unclear or imprecise. Perhaps most importantly, the Gutierrez case changed conversations over the dinner tables and in the halls of power alike. It exposed the high price of bureaucratic delays and the human cost of treating cries for help as variables in a logistics equation instead of sacred trust. The anger, heartbreak, and hope that followed Maria's death became part of a larger movement, the stubborn belief that in America, no one should be left unheard during their most desperate hour. Overview of investigation and new mysteries. The investigation that followed Maria Gutierrez's murder brought the entire city of Madfield into a strange and haunted limbo, the air thick with suspicion, unanswered questions, and the grim determination to piece together a narrative from the fragments left behind. The case, already blighted by controversy and public outrage, now became a labyrinth of forensics, speculation, and uneasy discoveries sprinkled throughout the community. Detectives, pressured by the glare of media scrutiny and the weight of public expectation, resolved to leave no stone unturned, even as every new clue seemed to deepen the mystery. Crime scene investigators spent days combing through Juan Morales' modest apartment. With every search, they grew more unsettled. Among the clutter, they found not only the horrifying remains of Maria, but also traces of what appeared to be animal bones, some old, some more recent, scattered in refuse bags and hidden in corners. Early rumors ran wild. Was Madfield dealing with a serial killer? Had Morales hurt more people, and could there be more victims yet undiscovered? For a tense window of days, the town sat paralyzed by these whispered possibilities. Autopsies and forensic experts were brought in from Chicago and St. Louis. Their expertise sought out to distinguish between human and non-human remains. Each new specimen was cataloged and tested: femurs, small vertebrae, fragments of rib. Police statements maintained a cautious optimism, reassuring the public that no evidence correlated Morales with other missing persons cases, but paranoia proved stubborn. Local online forums erupted in speculation, linking every unsolved disappearance, every runaway case of the last decade, to Morales' name. The police, in an attempt at transparency, even released periodic reports detailing what had been tested and what had been ruled out. Technologically, the case propelled Madfield's law enforcement out of their comfort zone. Evidence was shipped to advanced crime labs where DNA analysis, trace residue tests, and digital forensics were carried out at a pace that belied the lab's usual backlog. Detectives pored over security footage not just from the apartment block, but from gas stations, parking lots, and downtown intersections, searching for any clue that Morales hadn't acted alone, or that someone else had entered his apartment before or after the crime. Each analysis provided answers but also more questions, as timelines were narrowed, then reconstructed and then blown apart by conflicting evidence. An equally complex front opened up in witness interviews. Neighbors' recollections were contradictory and frequently tainted by hindsight bias. Some insisted Morales had always struck them as an odd loner who'd never made eye contact, while others said they'd seen Maria talking to someone suspicious days before her death, a shadowy figure who bore little resemblance to Morales. Children from the neighborhood recalled seeing a strange van parked outside the building at odd hours. Detectives interviewed former landlords and local shopkeepers, trying to build a picture of Morales' life before Madfield, but documentation was thin and legal name changes complicated the trail. Every unanswered question bred a new theory. One key area of focus became the animal bones themselves. Though preliminary forensic analysis identified most as non-human, rumors persisted in the community, especially among those reluctant to trust official findings. The presence of other remains blurred an already traumatic discovery, spurring obsessive amateur sleuthing. Facebook groups and Reddit threads bristled with armchair detectives parsing police photos for missed clues, speculating about cults or much larger conspiracies hiding beneath Madfield's placid surface. The town struggled to distinguish fact from fevered imagination, yet with each testing result, experts confirmed the bone's animal origin: pigs, dogs, and in a few cases wild game species that suggested Morales had once participated in local informal hunting circles. Detectives wondered if this detail could help explain his psychological profile. Was he desensitized to blood and death or merely unkempt and unbothered by grisly refuse? A psychological consultant called in by the state speculated privately in his report that Morales' behaviors were consistent with trauma, alienation, and perhaps untreated mental health issues, but nothing definitively criminal in and of itself. While much public attention focused on the bones and forensics, a parallel track was devoted to unraveling apparent inconsistencies in Morales' timeline. Investigators meticulously reconstructed Maria's final movements with phone records, GPS pings, though limited by the outdated local tower tech, and interviews with friends, classmates, and local business owners. Several inconsistencies emerged: conflicting sightings, time gaps in phone activity, and a window during which Morales' whereabouts could not be independently verified. These gaps, though ultimately accounted for by grainy surveillance and digital check-ins, launched a wave of conspiracy theories and forced police to defend each step of their process at multiple press conferences. Media, hungry for drama, played up possible connections to other disappearances in Illinois and neighboring states, even as authorities repeatedly insisted there was no such evidence. True crime podcasts devoted entire episodes to the Madfield mystery. This attention, though sometimes careless with accuracy, forced the department into an unprecedented era of openness, releasing body cam footage, exhibiting chains of evidence at community meetings, and inviting oversight from state and federal agencies. Local officials, battered by criticism, promised transparency as a permanent fixture in all future investigations. Lingering doubts still haunted Madfield. Many in the community struggled to accept that the horror was the work of a single, isolated perpetrator, and nothing more. Questions surfaced about whether Morales perhaps had help, or if the failure in responses and communication between agencies during Maria's case could have allowed for accomplices to escape. A persistent rumor held that a second, unidentified person may have been spotted near the apartment in the early morning hours following the murder, but like so many leads, this one faded under the scrutiny of evidence, dismissed by investigators as a case of mistaken identity. Meanwhile, the impact of the investigation on the city's social fabric could not be overstated. Public trust, already fragile, was now threaded with suspicion. Many residents formed neighborhood watch groups, sought to arm themselves, or invested in elaborate home security systems. Community forums filled with mutual accusations, deepening racial and class lines. Routine interactions like a stranger pausing at a driveway or an unfamiliar vehicle parked curbside grew charged with meaning as Madfield adjusted with difficulty to its newly fractured sense of normalcy. In the official aftermath, the final investigative report painstakingly cataloged every lead, every test, every interview, detailing with almost clinical precision the arduous path toward clarity. Investigators publicly ruled out links to other unsolved crimes and urged the public for their own sake to let those ghosts rest. Still, the report could not erase the scars left on Madfield, both physical and psychological. For some, it brought closure. For many, it left only the bitter taste of questions that would never be fully answered. Ultimately, the Maria Gutierrez case exposed not only the practical limitations and vulnerabilities of a small-town police force facing an extraordinary crime, but also the mysteries that linger after the cameras move on. In the court of public opinion, the full truth about what happened inside that apartment, both in the hours leading up to Maria's death and in the years of isolation that shaped Morales, remains elusive, a permanent riddle woven into the fabric of Madfield's collective memory. The controversial trial and the final verdict. The trial of Juan Morales, accused in the harrowing murder of Maria Gutierrez, unfolded in the Madfield County Courthouse under relentless scrutiny. By the time jury selection began, the town had become a media circus. National outlets camped out beside local reporters, while opinion columns debated guilt, innocence, and whether true justice could ever be achieved in a case already tainted by tragedy and public outrage. Each morning, camera crews jostled for a glimpse of Maria's grieving family, her mother often clasping a rosary between trembling hands, and of Morales himself, haggard, shrunken, his face almost unreadable behind glassy eyes. The courthouse atmosphere was electric, a stifling blend of anticipation and dread. Protesters calling for justice gathered daily outside, their signs a riot of messages. No more forgotten voices. Justice for Maria. Counter-protesters, fearing a scapegoat, warned against turning the case into a referendum on Madfield's entire Latino immigrant population. Every hearing featured new security protocols in anticipation of outbursts or violence from the packed, tense gallery. Opening arguments and the people's case. Prosecutors arrived prepared to paint Morales as cold, calculating, and remorseless. They began by replaying the battered, static-laden 911 audio, Maria's terrified cries echoing through the silent courtroom. Several jurors visibly shuddered. The state called detectives, forensic experts, and Maria's relatives, building a timeline that, while imperfect, pinned Morales at the scene. State forensic scientists described the grisly evidence: fingerprints, blood spatters, inconclusive DNA, the trash bags with carefully dismembered remains. Though technical, their testimony was heavy with implied horror. Throughout, the prosecution hammered at inconsistencies in Morales' story. For every expression of regret Morales had muttered under interrogation, prosecutors replayed security footage showing him calmly trailing Maria. They alleged premeditation and an intent to silence, not a crime of passion. A parade of witnesses, Maria's friends, the man who heard her cries, even a local grocer who sold Morales duct tape 2 hours before the attack, all completed this haunting tapestry. The prosecution's narrative was clear. This was not merely a tragedy of circumstance, but an act of monstrous cruelty that called for the harshest penalty the law allowed. The defense responds. Morales' public defender, a seasoned but visibly weary attorney, tried to inject reasonable doubt into almost every facet. She argued that the investigation, rushed by public outcry and political pressure, was riddled with gaps as officials scrambled to appease the angry town. She highlighted the outdated 911 system, the lack of witnesses who saw the actual assault, and conflicting timelines. Morales, she insisted, never intended to kill Maria. He panicked, acted irrationally, and afterward fell into a dissociative state, as evidenced by his confusion and shoddy cover-up, rather than cunning. The defense also brought in a psychologist specializing in trauma and acculturative stress, who testified that Morales showed classic symptoms of severe isolation, identity fracture, and long-standing mental health struggles that had never been properly diagnosed nor treated. The argument was not that he was insane, but that he was a product of years of cultural disenfranchisement and silent suffering, and that these factors should mitigate the verdict. Despite their efforts, the defense struggled to counter the emotional magnitude of the prosecution's case. Each cross-examination felt heavy, bordering on desperate, as the defense pressed witnesses for inconsistencies, sometimes provoking anger from a grieving Gutierrez family member or a juror. In private, Morales appeared numb, answering questions in quiet monotone, shaking his head when asked if he understood the full extent of what he'd done. Media frenzy and public debate. Parallel to the legal battle inside, the outside world was engaged in its own trial by media. Opinion shows grilled so-called experts about evidence and bias, while the Spanish-language press focused on the pain of the Madfield Mexican-American community. Cable news endlessly reran the courtroom tears of Maria's mother. On social media, hashtags both for and against Morales trended. Anonymous leaks, transcripts of police interviews, psychological reports, even unverified rumors of further possible crimes, churned the public's appetite for drama, leaving the jury sequestered to protect the integrity of deliberations. Multiple advocacy groups weighed in. Immigrant rights organizations called for an end to racial scapegoating, pointing out that cases with white victims and white perpetrators rarely generated such broad condemnation of an entire community. Victims' advocacy groups focused on the need for stronger emergency response laws nationwide. Local religious leaders, some of whom knew both families, urged forgiveness while also demanding institutional accountability. Deliberations, divisions, and the verdict. After weeks of testimony, the jury, 9 women and 3 men with a mix of ethnicities and life experiences, began deliberations. Reports would later reveal their debates were long and complex. Some clung to the psychological explanations and found genuine doubt regarding Morales's intent. Others, haunted by Maria's cries and the brutality of the killing, found the act unforgivable regardless of circumstance. During the tense 2-day wait, reporters speculated about everything from a possible mistrial to a surprise acquittal. Madfield waited, the courthouse patrolled by both police and community volunteers, hoping to keep the peace whatever the outcome. In the end, the jury returned with a split but decisive judgment. Guilty of murder in the first degree, but, citing factors related to Morales's mental health and lack of prior record, they recommended a life sentence without parole rather than the death penalty. The judge imposed an additional 30 years of enhanced supervision should Morales ever be released in a future review, and at the Gutierrez family's request, ordered his name placed on a statewide violent offender registry. The ruling made clear the law's maximum punishment short of execution, but an explicit refusal to take another life in the name of justice. The aftermath, reflections, relief, and lingering pain. The verdict was met with a cacophony outside the courthouse. Maria's family expressed mixed feelings, immense relief tempered by the sadness that no judicial outcome could restore their daughter. Some protesters chanted for harsher punishment, others decried what they saw as racial scapegoating and rushed justice. Madfield, already battered, now strained to recover its sense of safety and community. Juan Morales, for his part, left the courtroom subdued and silent. Reporters noted that he neither looked back at the gallery nor spoke to his own family. His attorney announced plans to appeal based on alleged procedural errors and emotional jury bias, but few believed any court would overturn the core findings of guilt. In the weeks that followed, Maria's case entered the canon of American true crime lore. Court TV specials, podcasts, and books stoked debate about trauma, the shortcomings of small-town justice, and the ethics of punishment. Madfield's mayor convened a commission on legal reform and mental health in the justice system, reinforcing that justice was not only about verdicts, but also about reckoning with the forces, failures, and wounds that gave rise to tragedy in the first place. The earthquake transforms the U.S. emergency response system. In the wake of Maria Gutierrez's tragedy, no aspect of American public safety remained untouched. What had started as a local catastrophe in Madfield rapidly reverberated across state lines, morphing into a watershed moment for the entire country's emergency response infrastructure. The flaws in the 911 system were no longer just statistics buried in bureaucratic reports. They were laid bare for the world to see, amplified by raw recordings, damning timelines, and the excruciating human cost of institutional delay. It was no exaggeration for activists and reformers to call it an earthquake. The aftershocks would eventually change how millions of Americans called for help, and how their cries were met. The transformation that followed didn't come overnight, nor without bitter debate. In the earliest days after the case broke nationally, congressional hearings became must-watch TV. Grieving relatives, technologists, frontline dispatchers, and national advocacy groups lined up before the cameras, telling stories not only of Maria Gutierrez, but of countless others who'd been lost in the gaps, victims whose desperate calls were missed, misrouted, or misunderstood. Panels of lawmakers and police chiefs confronted a system that, for all its patriotic branding, was a patchwork of aging hardware, inconsistent training standards, and procedures that too often operated with chilling indifference to urgency or clarity. One of the first major revelations came with the publication of a federal review into emergency communications. Investigators mapped the flaws in 911 around the country, from small rural dispatch centers that still logged calls by hand, to major cities where GPS tracking was laughably imprecise, to entire counties where Spanish-language operators were rare, if not absent altogether. The review uncovered that over 50% of dispatch centers were operating on software more than a decade old. While interagency communications, the supposed backbone of crisis response, were prone to failure under even modest stress. In this raw climate, the law began to change. Illinois was the first to move, spurred by both a bruised public conscience and mounting legal threats from the Gutierrez family's attorneys. Maria's Law, hurried through the State House with bipartisan support, imposed unyielding standards for 911 technology, personnel training, and response timelines. The law mandated that all emergency centers regularly update their hardware and software, maintain GPS and cell tower interoperability, and require every dispatcher to undergo crisis de-escalation and trauma awareness training. The ripple effect was immediate. Within 6 months, over 20 other states introduced similar legislation, and a handful of high-profile lawsuits forced counties to replace their analog radios, digitize address registries, and hire multilingual staff. The cultural impact of these reforms, however, was as significant as the technical overhaul. Law enforcement agencies that had long resisted outside scrutiny found themselves suddenly under the microscope. National networks aired exposés on profiling and discrimination in emergency response. Communities of color, long marginalized in these systems, spoke out through town halls and class action filings. Maria's case came to symbolize a promise. No call for help would ever again be filtered through the lens of apathy, incompetence, or bias. At the National Emergency Services Convention, a new ethos emerged. Dispatchers and first responders would see themselves first and foremost as the guardians of that voice on the line, no matter who was calling. At the practical level, the rollout of Next Generation 911, NG 911, accelerated substantially. National funding streams prioritized communities most in need, especially those that had previously been underserved, like rural towns with high immigrant populations or inner-city districts hit by poverty and violence. The new systems didn't just patch existing vulnerabilities, they allowed citizens to send texts, videos, and even live GPS tracking snippets directly to operators. For the first time, someone afraid to speak, perhaps for fear of being overheard by an attacker, could tap out a silent plea and trust that help would find them. Real-time translation services were embedded so that language would never be a fatal barrier again, but technological change, critical as it was, could never be the whole story. As part of the reform package, public education campaigns launched on a scale reminiscent of major health initiatives. Ads ran on bus shelters, social media, and Spanish-language radio teaching people how and when to call for help, what information to provide, and, crucially, reassuring those in vulnerable positions that using 911 was not a risk of exposure to immigration authorities. Community liaisons, often drawn from local faith or advocacy groups, became bridges between the old system's failings and the new commitment to equality and safety for all. Civic engagement soared in the aftermath. Task forces in dozens of states invited survivors and families of the lost, people like the Gutierrezes, to share their stories at legislative hearings, or serve as advisory members reviewing emergency call archives. Self-styled Maria's Watch neighborhood programs emerged, dedicated both to keeping local officials accountable and to ensuring no one felt alone in a crisis ever again. The story wasn't just about fixing call centers, it was about shifting a culture so that bureaucracy would never again stand in the way of compassion. Yet progress was uneven, and the backlash at times was fierce. Some police unions pushed back on new training mandates, decrying what they called impossible expectations, and resenting the spotlight on their failures. Strapped rural counties pleaded for time and extra funding, citing technical debts that stretched back decades. More than a few politicians, chastened by viral outrage, made public vows to never again let a call go unanswered, even while privately negotiating carve-outs for their districts. The debates grew especially sharp around questions of equity, how best to serve non-English speakers, how much discretion dispatchers should have, and how to measure the true success of reform when the stakes were so personal and the failures so devastating. Amid all the turbulence, the meaning of Maria's name evolved from symbol of tragedy to catalyst for hope. Civil rights leaders drew on her legacy to lobby for expanded anti-discrimination protections in public safety. Survivors who had once remained silent found new confidence in coming forward, revealing that the system could listen and change. Over time, the reforms even began to yield measurable results. Response times ticked downward, public trust in local call centers stabilized, and a rash of stories surfaced about lives saved thanks to the very protocols inspired by Madfield's darkest night. By the 5-year anniversary of Maria Gutierrez's death, the U.S. emergency response system had a new face. One made not only of state-of-the-art tech and fast-tracked hiring, but of humility, empathy, and the collective insistence that no one's voice, however desperate or quiet, should be ignored. There were still tragedies, still imperfections, but observers agree, the earthquake in Madfield sent tremors strong enough to rewire a nation's conscience. In the corridors of police academies, the pulse of call centers, and the halls of Congress, a single lesson endured. Whenever the line rings, the answer must always be swift, skilled, and above all human. Community, public opinion, and profound lessons. The aftermath of the Maria Gutierrez tragedy reached far beyond news headlines and televised vigils. It sent shockwaves through the very heart of the American social fabric. In Madfield and across the nation, the painful public reckoning over Maria's fate triggered conversations that would force communities, media institutions, advocates, and policymakers alike to re-examine their assumptions, responsibilities, and blind spots. For Madfield's Mexican-American and immigrant families, the case had an immediacy and gravity that the broader public struggled to appreciate. Many families found themselves abruptly thrust into the national conversation, their daily lives scrutinized under the glare of sensationalist headlines and polarizing cable news debates. The narrative was not simply about a single crime, but about the long-standing, quietly festering fractures in American life, suspicion toward newcomers, stereotypes about race and class, and a tendency to blame entire communities for the actions of individuals. For these families, the pain was twofold: grieving Maria's loss while also pushing back against narratives that painted them as inherently at fault, or perpetually other. As the town processed these wounds, community leaders stepped forward. In churches, school auditoriums, and local businesses, conversations shifted from hushed fear to determined unity. Pastors and teachers organized town halls, inviting residents to share stories of bias and misrepresentation. Local newspapers began running in-depth features, not about the sensational details of the crime, but about the everyday reality of being a Mexican-American in Madfield, the struggle to secure fair wages, the pride in cultural traditions, the constant labor to prove belonging. Maria's family, especially her brother Luis, played a pivotal role, offering their grief as a wake-up call and their resilience as an anchor for neighbors wrestling with anger and despair. Conclusion and social awakening. Bell. After the courtroom lights have faded and the endless stream of headlines slows to a trickle, what remains are the resounding echoes of a tragedy that shook more than just a single community. The Maria Gutierrez case, with all its heartbreak, outrage, and uneasy reckonings, carves an indelible mark on the collective American psyche, a scar that throbs beneath the surface, whispered about in kitchens and classrooms, debated in city halls, and quietly mourned in communities all too familiar with being overlooked. In the months and years that followed the verdict, Madfield and communities like it across the United States were left grappling with a new, uneasy awareness. It's an awareness that transcends any single family's grief or one police department's failures. The lesson is as uncomfortable as it is essential. America's lifelines, its systems of safety, justice, and compassion, are only as strong as their commitment to serve every citizen, every time, regardless of language, background, or the zip code from which a desperate call for help is placed. For the Gutierrez family, closure is more a process than an event. They find themselves moving forward with a mix of pride for their advocacy and lingering pain for the world that failed Maria. Her story becomes a touchstone for others, immigrant families confronting similar vulnerabilities, and the silent armies of parents, siblings, and community leaders determined to make sure no voice is ever again dismissed as unimportant or unclear. The impact is ripple-like, spreading outward. City councils pass new resolutions, grassroots watchdog groups monitor emergency response metrics, and a new generation of advocates emerges, shaped by the memory of Maria's unanswered plea. But the case's resonance is not contained only in its policies or its procedural reforms. There's a subtler, more personal wake-up call that reverberates through the everyday choices and values of American society. Suddenly, the notion that "it can't happen here" fades, replaced by a cautious empathy and a recognition of shared vulnerability. Town hall discussions become more inclusive, with translation available and invitations extended to once marginalized residents. Public schools incorporate lessons on civic participation and emergency readiness, using Maria's story as both example and warning. Pastors, imams, and rabbis address safety and solidarity in their sermons, drawing moral lines about whose lives deserve attention and justice. Media outlets, chastened by earlier missteps, begin to approach stories involving at-risk communities with more nuance, striving to accurately represent victims and their families, rather than slotting them into tired tropes or convenient headlines. Survivor networks reach across city and state lines, sharing resources, legal counsel, and emotional support, turning isolated tragedies into catalysts for national awareness campaigns. Even the entertainment industry, always hungry for compelling narratives, faces new pressure to avoid sensationalizing violence against marginalized groups. Writers, directors, and producers are challenged to offer dignity, complexity, and hope, along with the harrowing details. Most profoundly, however, the Maria Gutierrez case forces a critical societal self-examination. Ordinary people feel the shockwaves and are stirred to reconsider their own beliefs and small daily actions, whether it's choosing to intervene rather than look away when someone is in trouble, or reaching out to neighbors of different backgrounds even when unsure of what to say. A new sense of shared responsibility takes root. Maria's name is invoked at activism workshops, in city budgets, and by lawmakers debating the next round of criminal justice reforms. The lessons extracted from the pain serve as compass points for future policymaking, community building, and even personal relationships. The meaning of justice itself becomes a topic of public debate, not just as punishment for one man, but as a renewed call to proactively guarantee safety nets for all. Across the country, small towns and big cities alike reassess the funding, training, and diversity of their 911 call centers and law enforcement agencies. There is an outpouring of initiatives aimed at nurturing trust, not just compliance, accessibility, not just efficiency. These efforts, imperfect and incremental, nonetheless represent an honest reckoning with both the system's original intent and its tragic shortcomings. Above all, the enduring legacy of the Maria Gutierrez case is an insistence that every voice is sacred, especially when raised in fear. The wake-up call is not merely about fixing broken policies or upgrading technologies, though those are vital. It's about human empathy, about looking past the safe boundaries of our own routines and seeing the person behind every emergency. Communities begin to redefine neighbor and belonging as verbs as much as nouns. There are stories of neighbors checking in with one another more regularly, of local leaders quietly setting up peer support networks, of children organizing first aid classes after school. There is no easy ending, and no single answer that can erase the pain or restore what was lost. Yet just as no one factor caused the tragedy, so too does no single solution suffice to prevent its recurrence. The conclusion America is left with, years after the cameras have packed away and the politicians' promises have faded, is that vigilance, compassionate, systemic, and unsparing, is the only real defense against future heartbreak. Maria's legacy, engraved in policy and memory alike, endures as both a warning and an aspiration, that a truly just society leaves no cry for help unanswered and no person unseen. The tragedy forces us all to listen harder, act sooner, and measure our communities not by their calm but by their courage in the face of crisis.